The GPS claimed I was 3 miles from the trailhead, but the trees here hadn't changed since I started walking an hour ago. I checked my watch, hoping for a glitch in the timekeeping, but the seconds ticked forward with cruel precision. The air grew thick and stagnant, smelling faintly of ozone and old rot. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the earth itself was trying to keep me from moving. I tried to retrace my path, but the footprints I had made were gone, swallowed by the unchanged moss. A low hum began to vibrate in my teeth, rising in pitch until it drowned out the wind. I screamed for help, but the sound died instantly, absorbed by the silent, unmoving woods around me. My phone screen flickered, displaying a map that showed no roads, no trails, only an endless expanse of black. I realized then that the battery wasn't draining because of usage, but because something was feeding on the signal. The trees weren't just stationary, they were watching, their bark shifting subtly like breathing skin. I turned back to face where I came from, expecting to see the trailhead lights in the distance. Instead, I saw myself standing there, staring at me with hollow eyes, waiting for me to take the next step so it could finally move forward. I never built windows facing the woods because I wanted total silence, but silence has a way of curdling into something else. At precisely 3 a.m, the woodpecker-like tapping begins against the rear wall, steady and desperate. It is not an animal, it is a fist pounding on timber, followed by a muffled plea that chills my blood instantly. The voice is unmistakable because it is mine, begging for entry with a terror I have never felt in my own life. I press my ear to the cold insulation, straining to hear the cadence of my own panic from the outside dark. There are no trees close enough to block the sound, only the vast, empty forest that swallows light and hope alike. I grab the flashlight, my hands shaking so violently the beam dances wildly across the interior walls. The knocking stops the moment the light flickers on, leaving a ringing silence that feels heavier than noise. I tell myself it is just the wind playing tricks on an isolated mind, a stress-induced hallucination born of loneliness. But then I remember why I chose this specific cabin, far from any road or neighbor. I look down at my hands, realizing they are stained with fresh soil and splintered wood chips from last night's digging. The voice isn't trying to get in because it is lost. It is screaming because I buried it alive just to be sure no one could ever hear me again. The local rangers warned against using firewood from the black birch grove, but the smoke smells like burning hair now. I told myself it was just old insulation melting off the logs, a harmless coincidence in this remote cabin. The flames crackled with an unnatural wetness, snapping like dry bones rather than wood. As the night deepened, the shadows on the walls began to stretch and twist into elongated human shapes. I tried to bank the fire, but my hands shook too violently to grasp the poker properly. A low, guttural whispering seemed to rise from the hearth itself, echoing voices I couldn't quite place. The scent grew thicker, cloying and coppery, coating the back of my throat with a metallic taste. I realized then that the bark on those branches hadn't been white and peeling, but pale and smooth like skin. My flashlight beam caught something floating in the ash, a small, curled finger bone. Panic seized my chest as I remembered where I had gathered those specific logs during the storm. The rangers didn't warn us because the trees were dangerous. They warned us because the trees were hungry. I looked down at my own hands and see the skin turning white and peeling away to reveal the dark, woody grain beneath. We weren't burning their bodies in the fire. We were feeding ourselves back into the grove. The coffee in the chipped enamel mug was still hot enough to scald my fingers, which shouldn't have been possible given the freezing wind howling through the pines. I stepped over the rotting remains of what used to be a fire pit, the wood blackened and crumbled by decades of rain and neglect. The sign at the trailhead clearly stated this campsite had been abandoned since 1987 due to a series of unexplained disappearances. Yet here sat a perfectly set table, complete with plates that hadn't tarnished or accumulated a single speck of dust. A loaf of bread, sliced neatly and wrapped in wax paper, rested on a wooden board that smelled faintly of yeast and warmth. I reached out, my heart hammering against my ribs, and touched the crust. It was soft, yielding, and unmistakably fresh. The silence of the forest felt heavy, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath in anticipation. I noticed then that the steam rising from the mug formed a distinct shape before dissipating into the cold air. It looked like a hand reaching out, beckoning me to take the seat opposite the empty chair. I backed away slowly, realizing that the preservation wasn't a miracle but a trap baited with comfort. The date on the newspaper left beside the plate matched today's, but the headline warned of a storm that hadn't arrived yet. As I turned to flee, the steam from the coffee coalesced into a face that smiled with teeth too sharp for a human being. I ran until my lungs burned, leaving the perfect meal behind in the shadows. Back at my car, I checked my phone to call for help, only to see the battery indicator flicker and die. The forest held its breath, waiting for my heartbeat to sync with theirs. I used to love hunting these woods, chasing the flash of white tails through the pines. But 3 months ago, the panic vanished from their eyes, replaced by a hollow, unblinking stare. Now when I walk the trail, they do not bolt into the underbrush. They stand perfectly still among the ferns, statues carved from shadow and bone. One by one, as I pass, each deer rotates its neck with mechanical precision to keep me in view. It is not curiosity that drives them. It is a silent, collective vigilance that chills my marrow. I have tried wearing masks, changing scents, even walking backward, but their gaze never wavers. They are not watching me because they recognize me as a threat or prey. They are watching me because they know exactly what comes next. The silence of the woods is no longer empty. It is full of anticipation. I realize now that I am not the hunter tracking them through the trees. I am the offering being escorted to the altar, and the path does not lead back to my car, but deeper into the dark where something older waits. He didn't scream when the reflection blinked, which was the first sign that something was terribly wrong. We were just taking a water break on the Appalachian Trail, miles from any cell service or help. I watched him lean over the crystal-clear creek, his face hovering inches above the dark surface. Then, while his eyes remained wide and staring, the image in the water closed them slowly, deliberately, and held them shut for 3 long seconds. My partner scrambled back, slipping on wet rocks, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He wouldn't look at the water again, nor would he meet my gaze when I tried to ask what he had seen. For the rest of the hike, he kept his hood up and his hands over his face, muttering about how it wasn't him anymore. By nightfall, he refused to let me set up camp near any body of water, terrified of what might be watching from beneath. I tried to reason with him, reminding him that reflections are just light bouncing off a surface, but he shook his head violently. He claimed the thing in the water had been smiling before it blinked, a smile too wide for a human face. Now, sitting by our firelight, I notice he hasn't removed his hands from his face once since we started walking. I look down at my own boots, muddy and tired, and realize with a jolt of ice-cold dread that I haven't seen my partner's actual face since the creek. The needle didn't spin toward the magnetic pole of the earth, but locked onto a dark shape moving silently between the pines behind us. We had stopped running 10 minutes ago, hoping silence would mask our heartbeat, but the brass instrument trembled in my hand as if sensing a predator's breath. Every time I turned away from the forest, the needle swung back, pointing relentlessly at whatever watched us from the shadows. It wasn't north that guided lost hikers here, it was hunger. We tried moving faster, deeper into the woods, but the device remained fixed, an unblinking eye directed at our pursuer's position. The trees grew thicker, blocking out the twilight, and the cold air seemed to thicken around our ankles. I looked back over my shoulder, scanning the darkness for movement, but saw only stillness. Yet the compass refused to budge, its iron heart beating in rhythm with something unseen. We were not being chased by an animal or a person, but by the forest itself, closing in like a tightening fist. The needle began to vibrate violently, pulling my wrist forward as if dragging me toward the end of the world. I realized then that we had never been trying to escape. We were being led exactly where we needed to go. The needle wasn't pointing at what followed us through the trees, but at the thing we had become when we entered them.